to Mindcrime Liberty Show with me, Swindon Dobson, and him, Tim Patton. Today we discuss, is free speech a unicorn? Tim, what do you mean here?
About a year ago, we had Right Ruminations on, a former YouTuber, on what would a community devoted to free speech would look like. Today I'd like to discuss, we've done similar episodes like this in the sort of Randian format of the Aristotelian axis does exist and exist, and we've done a number of things like in this format. So you could also call this Does Free Speech Exist? The left likes to passively aggressively make fun of the free speech warriors on the right or right center by saying that free speech never existed historically for civil rights activists, communists, and anarchists throughout the days of the United States, and for that matter, Britain, Commonwealth countries, and the major European powers. Recently on a roundtable with Todd Lewis and Terminal Philosophy, both former guests on this show, and Keith brought up the point that they didn't let Marx's book got by the czarist censors because no one could understand it. So historically, censorship of some variety against books, other publications exist. And currently, Chris Cutrone, a Marxist of some variety, was doing a Q&A, and someone asked him a related question regarding free speech. He responded that Doug Lane, he's been on a podcast of his, he's Zero Books, Mark Fisher, somewhat related to him, can say whatever he wants about Marxism, but not about vaccines on YouTube. The elite censors don't view Marxism in Cutrone's version to be a real threat, rather a book project, so they let it go. It just flies under the radar. So I guess the better question is, does free speech exist to taboo dangerous ideas? I think that's the thing we really have to settle in here. Because many regimes will allow you to have free speech about things which they don't care about. You have lots of debates over, which person is a better fantasy soccer player or baseball player, or, no one really per se cares about. Now, you might be able to make political allegories out of this, but in direct terms, you don't really. Back to the existence things. If something were to exist, it has to be defined. Unicorns don't exist, but certain aspects of them are plausible. Some horse-like thing with horns seems plausible. So is the eating rainbows not so much. Unicorns, of course, in a fictional world exist. But in the quote-unquote real world, unicorns don't exist. I mean, they're like four-sided triangles or hot and cold steak. However, in this sense, they are fictional. So is free speech something like that? Because on the one hand, it doesn't exist in the past. That's one of the things that most dissident people today recognize. And I mean, it didn't exist in the U.S. Civil War. It didn't exist in World War I or World War II in any country, for that matter. Nor does it exist in any one country on top of the aforementioned COVID. I mean, it doesn't exist in Ukraine. Opposition parties are banned. It doesn't exist in China. The Winnie the Pooh thing and stuff. Find me a society that free speech exists in that which isn't quote unquote fictional, or you don't have a fictional take on it. So most regimes aren't at the Orwellian level where book projects are banned. Maybe you could argue, ironically enough, the Soviet Union was that. But interestingly, if you formulate what you're doing in the wrong terms, some people might not view it as a book project. Jeffrey Tucker recounts a story where he traveled to Canada to give a talk on anarchism. When the border guard asked him what he was doing traveling to Canada, he just happened to say he was going to an anarchist conference. And he was like, whoa, said the guard. Tucker had to explain himself more or less, and he was detained, and he had to use the word professor and dissertation to get out of it. I mean, it made it sound like a pie-in-the-sky academic thing that was no threat. Arguably, that is what he and many intellectuals are doing. It's just kind of, it's not like they're organizing. Although there is a potential energy here. That's the interesting. There is a potential energy there. If you went up to Canada and say you're going to organize a vaccine skeptic rally, I doubt they'd let you in. Now, if you say that you're just going to go to a national park, they probably would because they want your money. There's lots of people that threaten the things. So on an intellectual level with ideas. I mean, I think Mr. West threatens the establishment by turning the blacks away from the Democratic Party and into a more hard-to-control group. Malcolm X did too. It's the reason why MLK has every street named after him in some city, I think. There's a darker reason, which a lot of left progressives tend to miss. Well, not all of them. Glenn Greenwald doesn't miss it, nor does Chris Cutrone. But a lot of you normie leftists do miss that sort of interesting insight here. Now, more practical concerns, which I think also need to be brought up. I don't worship Elon Musk. I'm going to start with that. Elon Musk is probably in bed with the CIA for his rocket company, and Tesla's heavily subsidized. But Elon Musk has bought Twitter and has reinstated some people, but not Alex Jones. But as far as more practical concerns, he's been in a recent brouhaha because I think his girlfriend and his child, the one named after this plane, were stalked. Now, whether the details are exactly true, you can imagine it being true. And no one in shitlib territory has any issue. So basically doxed his location, followed him. And, as Musk himself said, if anyone did this to Chuck Schumer or whatever, Joe Biden, there'd be like congressional investigations about doxing your location in that manner. But then again, everyone's a hypocrite on this. No one in shitlib territory, as I said, would had any problem going after the guy who did the wrestling meme about CNN, Nicki Minaj's unvaxxed relative, or of course SlateStarCodex. So the idea of privacy, to doxing seems to be what is done. So maybe the question is, in the ideal side, if there are people who are moderately famous, can they keep privacy and vice versa? Can people who are private, who write things, not be known, so to speak? On my opinion, Fauci and Schwab complain that they get harassed. I don't think the Bilderberg group publicly identifies their location. You should watch Max Blumenthal trying to get into the hotel where they were. But the state does limit the spread of... Now, to be fair to the right, to be fair to the left, one of the things that the left will complain about is like the state does limit the spread of like Bernie Sanders movements, BLM, certain anarchist groups, certain eco-terrorist groups too. Now, you could argue they're more hands-off. Of course they are. Of course they are more hands-off. You made on a recent roundtable with Todd that, the Stop Oil protesters, like if a bunch of nationalists did that, they would throw the book at them. Of course they do. But they still, in the end, arrest them at some point. It's not like they don't do anything. They do something. Maybe they don't do anything. But I do think they do something, at least something. I do agree there's disequal treatment, don't get me wrong. So, and the final point before I pass it to you is, forget shouting fire, but how about shouting obscenities with a megaphone? Can you shout a megaphone into a home of a person all the time? In a sense, this is free speech. Can you shout obscenities in a restaurant? Now you can say, well, what's the context? Is there private property? And furthermore, in the Balenciago thing, I have no clue how to say that necessarily. They have brought up the Supreme Court ruling, and they bring up this fact that, certain forms of quote-unquote degeneracy aren't allowed because they're not. But in that Supreme Court, they said it's not against free speech to be against. It's not against the First Amendment to be against child pornography. Was roughly the thing. So you could argue that's free speech. And of course, there's a street preacher in the U.S. who's from the U.S. who went to a gay village or a gay parade in England, and he got arrested. It's sort of an awesome thing, but because he was just preaching like a fire and brimstone thing. So arguably, on the reverse, pop music's like that then. So Swithin, does anyone believe in free speech without qualifications? What would be your take on that, Swithin?
Well, no, clearly not. Nobody would defend free speech in every and all situations. Walter Block doesn't go full free speech. You might think would be. Well, if you understand his system, then you understand why he has this sort of, you could say, an exception. Although he could argue that, well, I suppose you could argue from sort of libertarian Rothbardian tradition that they don't actually hold free speech as a value as such. Free speech is only a value insofar as it's a manifestation of private property, free exchange, homesteading, and that kind of thing. So Block, for instance, would say that you can't make threats to kill. You can't make verbal threats in that way because that's sort of analogous or in close to, well, threatening aggression. And aggression is wrong, therefore threats to aggression are, if they're, now clearly they would have to be in a context where they could be believable and they were intended, not in a situation like in film or something along those lines. So nobody really holds free speech as an absolute value. I think really with the idea with free speech is that there is, well, there's multiple ones. I mean, one would be John Stuart Mill would argue, free speech was there to help the discovery of the truth. You'd have all these counter narratives and counter arguments and debates, and this would be a way of getting towards truth. I think another aspect of the arguments for free speech is that there is a sense of who an individual is, and they should be able to express in a way who they are and what they think. And this is a sort of an aspect of being a fully individualized human, and they shouldn't be concerned for their safety or legal repercussions for saying something, because it's sort of an extension of themselves in a way. What I would say is, in most cases, though, I don't actually think people hold to the view that free speech actually helps discover truth. And I don't think in most cases people think that, we want a space for authentic self-expression of individuals. Historically, it would seem very clear to me to be the case that the left supported free speech in, say, the 60s and 70s, basically because, well, they were the people who were opposing the current power structures. And then when they become the dominant force, they then become the censors, which is an entirely consistent position in a certain sense. Well, of course, hate speech is bad, and we want to stop it. So, once we're in a position to do so, we will. So in a sense, it's consistent like that, but it's not. It doesn't seem to be principled in any reasonable way. So I think when you come to discussions, though, of free speech, I think you've got to be clear about what the purpose is. Is playing or speaking really, really, really loudly in a massive megaphone at someone's house, is that free speech? Well, you could argue. So, what I would firstly say is, when it comes to legality, areas that are like public thoroughfares or where there is, it's not entirely private. There's sort of like, the roads, and sort of like public areas as such, they're kind of different from being within a particular closed off room within a hotel or something along those lines. So I think you'd want to distinguish that as to what would constitute free speech, and depend sort of on the context. But primarily, I think in the debates, the political and things, the argument really for free speech, I would say, is that it helps discover truth. And so in a sense, you can sort of exclude argument and prevent some people from speaking if they don't share the goal, if they're just there to wind up the opposition or to troll. And to, now, that's not to say that trolls can be interesting and they can actually add value to debates. But if they're just going to do a screed or whatever, I mean, you could just sort of exclude them. Because I suppose really what you want is, in the context of truth discovery, is the best version of any possible argument, which doesn't necessarily imply in all venues having everybody possible to speak. You want the best versions of person to speak so that you can kind of work out what is right and what is not. So when it comes to free speech, I think really what you want to think about is kind of the teleology of free speech. What is the purpose of free speech? And I think then you can get some reasonable sort of guardrails on it in a way, because clearly, I mean, no one's really going to argue that if I'm abusive about your mother or something, that you should treat me as well as you did before I did. I didn't say that before I said that. I mean, that would be absurd. Or I laughed when your dog died and recorded and sent it to you. I mean, it in a sense, the people who argue say that free speech doesn't mean freedom from consequences are correct in certain respects, but in a sense, you could argue they commit sort of a Mott and Bailey fallacy. It's like, yeah, but you've got to take into account context, relationship, that kind of thing. I mean, if you're just some random, I mean, why do you care? Whereas if it's someone who's known to you personally, then of course it's just kind of a different context. So no, people don't support free speech, and I don't think people typically support it that much on. I don't think many people really do believe in free speech on truth discovery, or sort of like as an idea of individual authenticity. I think is rarely defended, and if it's defended on purely pragmatic grounds to advance a particular cause over and above free speech itself.
So the next line of questioning here, I'm just trying to answer myself too. Did it ever exist? And if I try to think about what would be the paradise, what would be the free speech golden age, I actually think, ironically enough, maybe the mid 2010s. I mean, both Greenwald and Tucker were commenting on this, that like the internet was still not totally, with the basic Twitter files, which basically brings up all the known knowns about what was happening. Like the internet's very, like Twitter is basically a subsidy of the intelligence services. They're spending like $4 million a year on like something like that, on like requests, to like look at accounts and so forth, and location data. Imagine it's true for Google and Facebook, as well as other things. I mean, so maybe the mid 2000s to like 2000, because the internet wasn't as regulated, but it was still existed. You get the blogosphere. And I think on other accounts we brought up, like the Ron Paul and Barack Obama presidency. I know Barack Obama was terrible. Okay, again, but like there's a sort of image of it. The same with image of Bernie Sanders, which people like Greenwald and Jimmy Dore like. Now, the reality is different, and I think Ron Paul is much more genuine. But, like, those were arguably created because of the early blogosphere and the internet. They sort of got big. Mises Institute used the internet, too, to get big. Their books are all free. And that's, to some extent, we're products of the Mises Institute. Like, I mean, I think you went to it, but, like, in some sense, the Mises Institute is, like, the reason that people know about it, to a large degree, is Ron Paul, and the Ron Paul campaign was probably one of the early internet campaigns and so forth. So maybe the early 2010s, like, because if you look at World War I, U.S. Civil War, Tom Lorenzo points that the mail service had a monopoly, de facto monopoly, and they wouldn't let papers that were not congruent with what the Lincoln regime was saying be carried. They just that's basically what the modern day version of what happens when you want to have a blog that's critical of a certain topic. So I don't know if there's any golden ages here. So I'm going to combine the next question here with you. And what do you make of the whole, like, street pictures, or for that matter, playing erotica or pornography in public, as well as, you did bring up like the question of like shouting obscenities here, or just shouting in a megaphone here. I think it's perfectly reasonable to have an auditorium that's more or less private, even in Capistan, where anything goes in there. I think that's within reason. Now the question is, what is within reason here? I mean, that's the arbinger word here. Now, if you have, like if you're showing up obscene film, which everyone else thinks is illegal, is that quote unquote free speech, so to speak? I don't know. It depends on what you think is legal versus illegal. Now, if you're just, and Greenwald again was talking this, I was doing a lot of preparation for this, and he was talking about how, like if you're organizing, and this is something that the Marxists would like, if you're organizing a strike against, let's say you're going to meet in an auditorium at a high school to organize a strike against Amazon, or for that matter, a coal company in 1910, could the police deny your permit? I don't think any gymnasium would allow an organization for a vaccine skeptic to allow to recently. Maybe now they would, but 12 months ago they went. So the question is dangerous ideas, like if you connect the dots. And, speaking of the consequence views, one of the things I think the state is implicitly aware of is that if X is true, in some sense, Y and Z becomes if Fauci indeed or Hancock isn't criminal as they say it is, and it comes out that such and such is a criminal. I think Assange has the same problem. If we realize that 9/11 was a false flag, or even if it wasn't a false flag, we went after the wrong country. These things come out. People will get angry at the regime, and it will lead to the regime's fall, or certain aspects of it will fall. So then violence, which is Z, becomes more likely. So I in some sense see the censors. I see at sometimes I can put it's an annoying cliche, but I can put myself into the censors' shoes, so to speak. So Swithin, what do you make about these other cases where there's violence or potential violence at it? I mean, I'm fine with it because, again, I don't really defend the current regime in any meaningful way. So I don't really care. I mean, they make oil expensive. Far from, I don't really care in that sense. But like street preachers playing erotica, from organizing the workers. What do you make of these cases, Swithin? Is it a unicorn? I'm going to ask again.
When it comes to, I was hinted this before. I mean, if you have a situation where you have a clearly private event, as in you enter, you leave, people know you're in there, you go, is a clearly demarcated situation. I mean, I would say, well, I would hold to the position that, well, yeah, basically anything goes. Now, I suppose you could claim, well, if you were in Ancapistan, you'd have some sort of covenant agreement, or you might have some agreement that maybe lowers your insurance premiums, which means that you can't have the Revolutionary Communist Party meeting in your building, in your gymnasium, to foment the revolution against the natural aristocracy or something. I mean, that's perfectly possible. Whether or not that would be a good thing to stop is another question, because that's always the problem with the censor. Is it makes sense if you can completely stamp out the idea to stop anyone taking it seriously and then overthrowing the regime. But if you get it so that it's kind of out there and you can't really stamp it out, but then you do try to stamp it out, then you actually, as it were, give it marketing, use some advertising, and then it becomes, oh, well, what's this idea that the government is very, very, very concerned to stamp out? I mean, that's so the census has an issue there, but organizing events or whatever in particular private locations, I don't see any real argument against them. I mean, may not be very good, and maybe you want to organize something slightly differently. Well, fine. But I could see that as being sort of like free speech in the traditional sense, because the way I would, as I say before, I think mostly it's like discovery of truth, and to some extent some sort of like sense of you being an individual and expressing yourself in a way, but not in like the really cliche way of like, oh no, be yourself. It's like, well, not really. We just sort of recognizes that I'm not you and you're not me, and we have different ways of looking at things. I think the public events like reading erotica in public or whatever, I think that's a more interesting case. I mean, there, I suppose, when you could support it, but most people don't. The question is, well, how could you defend that? Well, I suppose one way of approaching it is to say, well, these are sort of like public spaces, and so we need to make them sort of suitable for the general public. And I suppose really with that kind of stuff, you could say in general with children, if the idea that the community is there to sort of foster the good of let's use a traditional sort of Catholic concept, or Protestant one of the common good, then, you could see how this might be inimical to it. It'd be inappropriate, and it was just sort of the wrong context for it. And for that as well, this might justify restrictions on certain types of what could be depicted on billboards and other things in public, because this is like a very frontward-facing part of society, and it's one where you can't discriminate appropriately between who's seeing it and whatever, and it would be bad for sort of social order in sort of certain ways. One thing we haven't mentioned actually, which is normally brought up, people don't support free speech, is shouting fire in a crowded theatre. But the thing is that that's actually a really bad example, because it's quite easy. You can have like a contract written, or an implicit contract, which is, yeah, you don't deliberately shout fire in a theatre if there's not one there, because otherwise it breaks the contract of it breaks the agreement that allows you to go into the building. A more interesting case would probably be shouting fire in a public thoroughfare when you know there's a big lot of people, maybe it's a public event. I mean, so for instance, I've seen some of the pictures in Argentina for the World Cup. The pictures in Argentina for the World Cup victory, and there's loads of people there. When you shout fire there, then you could cause a stampede. Now, again, is that something I would justify? Well, actually, no. I think would probably say no, that's not a justifiable thing to do. Is it really a goal of expressing oneself? Is it leading to the discovery of truth? Well, no. And so I wouldn't really defend it. Just on like threats to kill in public, I mean, if you were to say, oh, you should go and burn down this place, or you should seize the means of production, I suppose my concern there is to what extent you can be considered a cause of an action that somebody else does. So if you're going to say, oh, seize the means of production, and then all the proles then go and take over the factory or whatever, have you caused that? Well, in a sense, yes, but in another sense, no. And I would generally be reticent in establishing legal culpability unless the threat was very specific and you were seemingly in some form of active conspiracy. Otherwise, it's very loose, and then you can get prosecuted for everything and anything. And actually, as well, a lot of the laws against free speech, you could argue, in a sense, a species of intellectual property law. I mean, actually, that's very true. Like defamation, it's as if you own your reputation, and so if someone defames you, then that's sort of legally actionable. Just one more thing before I forget. You mentioned doxing with Elon Musk. Clearly, again, if you have a platform like Twitter, is the purpose of there to reveal where people live? Well, not really. So, I mean, you could clearly, with, I think, reasonable consistency, prevent doxing taking place or banning people for doing it on a platform. But should doxing be illegal per se? Well, I don't think so, because you just look at the book and go, oh, yeah, this guy lives here. So I can't really see why that per se should be illegal to say from your own property to somebody else. But I can see why, and I can understand, I probably would myself, have a policy against doxing on a forum of some description. So hopefully that answers your question.
Is taking the mantle of free speech useful? We're both somewhat libertarians, right-libertarians, right-anarchists of some variety. And what is the upper limit of like one wants to say anyway? That's another way you could phrase it too. I mean, if you think you're going to be marginalized, then yes. This is why I, to a large extent, advocate it. I mean, I suspect my tribe, or things that people like me would be affiliated with, are going to be viewed as illegal or not explicitly allowed. And that's never a question, because like certain things are explicitly allowed, no one in general is against, even quote unquote tyrannical regimes, even regimes which abroad are considered tyrannical. No one really is against those kinds of discussions here, like cooking discussions. Like I imagine you can talk about cooking in North Korea or China or United States. Maybe not. Maybe it's full Orwellian. So like if you want to talk about non-dangerous ideas, ways to cook. Like, I doubt those YouTube channels are really suppressed. Although there was a Washington Post article about people doing cooking and gardening. I mean, we're on the express highway to the alt-right, because they were all prepping. The question is like free speech again on dangerous ideas, and like again, I think my tribe, and the last 3 years hasn't really made me less. If anything, has made me more sympathetic to the radical position here. Although you do have to leave, I do probably possibly leave out the fact that there could be other things that are banned and repressed, which also could be the case. But even that the case, I don't really care if the black population in the United States is annoyed at the Democratic Party. Doesn't bother me. I don't really care if Jeff Bezos' workers want to unionize. Doesn't bother me. I don't care if Netflix workers want to unionize. Doesn't bother me. I mean, I think these many of these companies get huge subsidies from the government anyway. So like a lot of things that like the normie, business right would be afraid of, I'm not really afraid of here. If anything, I think that would be a win for a lot of people. So in that sense, the things that Rohn talks about, like I'd actually also approve. I mean, the Libertarian Institute came out with a Keith Knight. This is Scott Horton's thing about like what do the dissident left and dissident right agree on, and like he said, unions. Like they're just freedom of association. They're no different than corporations. So if you think corporations are fine, then the workers should also be allowed to. So like those types of things, I don't really per se have anything. So like my own opinion, my tactical interests, I don't really have anything. Now the thing about like what the paleos call degeneracy, I'll put it broadly. Well, first of all, they aren't in a position to be the censors right now in any meaningful way. Maybe in Saudi Arabia, Qatar, they are in the position to be the censors. There are the censors. But we're not in Saudi Arabia or Qatar. And I'm not sure about the long-term prospect of which society will win out. Is Peter Zian right, or is Dugin right? I mean, that's the question. Like, who's long-term is going to win out? I mean, predictions about the future are always problematic. I still think North Korea could win out if everyone else gets into nuclear war or an asteroid hits. I mean, that's sort of like the Graham, or maybe like the Senghalese could win out. Which group will win out here? So I mean, but the paleos aren't really in a position of censoring anybody. I mean, they can barely. I mean, they're barely. I mean, in places like in Northern and Western Europe, which have more quote unquote common good speech laws, things that you can say in the United States and legally be allowed to say them. Again, you'll face implicit censorship. Like like the guy with the dog that he taught, or the cat that he taught to do the salute to, and things like that. Certain paraphernalia. So in that sense, we're not really in a position to do it. Swithin, what do you make of my thoughts here? I mean, how much of the mantle should we take here? I mean, I don't really see any things. I mean, we could just do what the left does. If we ever happen to get power, we'll just be. I guess to be correct, Paul Gottfried, it's the cultural left, and Rohn is the cultural left. That's kind of one out, not the economic left. And they'll just they have a consistent principle. Things they agree with, they're okay with. Things they don't agree with, they'll at minimum cut down on. What do you make of it? Should we take the mantle? I mean, should we be free speech absolutists? And go back to is this a unicorn?
I wouldn't use the term free speech as something I defend as such, because I think the term is very plastic. In the same way, I probably wouldn't go, I'm pro-freedom, because, well, what does it even mean? What I would say is, we should rally around the view that we need to know the best possible versions of all possible arguments in all possible arenas, because unless we know what they are, we will not know, well, we will be less sure of whether we have the right answer or not. Not to say you can't have the correct answer. I mean, for instance, you could know that 1 + 1 = 2 without having a very comprehensive argument as to why y doesn't necessarily follow, which, of course, you could. So I'm not saying you can't know anything, but in an ideal situation, what you want to do is to have the best version of one position versus the best version of another, so that you know what the right position to take is. I think framed in that way, I think is very easily defendable. When it comes to then you get beyond there, you get into like freedom of expression of the art stuff, which basically revolves around in most cases here, sex, swearing, and violence of certain types. And as you point out, the paleocons are not in a good position to censor anybody at present. But what I would say is, from a principled position against intellectual property, if the paleocons, for instance, were actually to go, well, you know what, we oppose intellectual property and we can abolish it, then actually all the stuff that's pushed us over new versions of Marvel or gay Superman or stuff like that, people could just ignore it because there'd be loads of other stuff that's made that's actually in the tradition of Superman that people actually might like and watch. And so with actually having intellectual property, it allows people who have the licenses to things, to franchises and I can't think of the right term. Different universes, etc. They have the only rights. It means that they can turn it and change it into something else, whereas they would have significantly less power to do so if this was basically freely copyable by everybody. And effectively, you could argue fan fiction would be legal fiction, and you could try to sell it and do your own versions, etc., and that wouldn't be illegal. So, in a sense, I would argue intellectual property encourages degeneracy, especially in this case. Now, of course, if you were to take the anti-intellectual property position completely, or to say that, well, basically owning an image is not a crime. So, for instance, this is the position of those who would argue that whilst the creation of child pornography should be illegal, the possession of it shouldn't be, because who is the victim? And so, if you were to take the strong position like that, then obviously lots of people, you could say some people are going to access things that may be bad for them. Now, people don't like put things in paternalistic fashion, but basically that's what people think. And some things are bad for people. But I think taking another position, taking a more sort of overt censor position, creates a lot of problems of infrastructure surveillance and lots of other things, and also there'll be ways of making your activity private anyway, and so to whether or not it's actually going to achieve the goal it sets out to achieve is another question. I mean, it's just the whole thing about, we got this online safety bill that's in England, and so it's about protecting children. I'm like, you might think that, but I'm pretty sure the outcome of this is going to be suppressing people you don't like politically rather than anything else. I mean, or generally law-abiding citizens who may or may not like a particular government policy on immigration, something like that. You will go after those sorts of people, or the petty bourgeoisie who have sort of hidden and have not paid some taxes. They'll go after those people. And that's what it'd be used for, and control and surveillance. I mean, that's what it'd be there for. Now, of course, the payload can say, "Oh, we wouldn't do that," but the infrastructure there would be there, and so if it is there, it could be used for it. So I think defending, but to circle back, defend free speech. I wouldn't say defend free speech. I would say defend Steel Manning in all areas. And I think could be relatively attractive if expressed that way.
The Steel Manning point is interesting. I would say that this very much reminds me of argumentation ethics here. Now, again, this goes into sort of, you could take this into dubious territory quickly. Like, one of the left commenters on argumentation ethics will say, well, I need a platform now, because if I have an idea, I should be allowed to and some people will make this argument about Alex Jones. They'll say, well, he's allowed to say what he says, but he doesn't have to be on Twitter. Now, again, I know Twitter is just basically a subsidy of the CIA, but I know that sounds like a hot take, but it's probably 90% true. Or if it's not true, it's they're awfully related here. At least in certain areas which people like Jones would deal in, or others would deal in. So maybe you're not allowed a platform. But see, this gets into the question, like, if you have a potential platform and you're being repressed here from the censor, and it's like, like who's I guess the question is who's exploiting whom. It's the old Leninist Hoppian question here, because I think Hoppe has a good take on it here too. Like who exactly exploits whom here? Like who's being repressed? Who's being platformed? And your point about like all these stupid new movies that have come out, being brandied about, you know, you could argue those, and we're talking about doing an episode on art in the future here, and you could argue those are actually far from being censored. Certain ideas are platformed very much so, quote unquote, illegitimately here, or I mean, you saw that with like some of the releases on, like they did want to drum up fear 2 years ago. So certain ideas not only don't get censored, they get put centerfold to the extent you can put them centerfold. And this goes back to the golden age questions here. I sort of did is like I don't think an event like 9/11 could happen again. I was thinking about this because like many people thought that everyone would be unified, and they sort of were 2 weeks later. But once after COVID lockdowns, they sort of were. There was a short honeymoon period. We weren't on the honeymoon period. We were basically on day 3. We were both. That's how we started this show. But like in this sense, I think the internet has created a new era in the same way the printing press and radio created new eras. Now, radio and TV arguably were in favor of the government, but the internet, like the printing press, I'd say is against centralized authorities here. Like what we're doing, for example. I mean, there's just too many podcasts out there now maybe AI could censor them all. I'm dubious of AI, but it could just be technological insofar as like speaking of IP, we can get most books and films for free. Now you might get a computer virus. That's a risk. So maybe it's worth just paying the $2 or whatever, or $6 if you're funding the author. Then yes, but there might be, it might just be technologically impossible to do certain ideas. And you talk about like, do the censors actually win? I don't know. I mean, I suspect that the censors do something. I think they do something. I'm not one of those people that think that like if speaking of platforming versus censoring, if Alex Jones got the same platform that Stephen Colbert got, if you just log onto a generic YouTube account and like an incognito browser in the United States, you're going to get a Stephen Colbert or an NBC clip of some variety. Could you imagine if it's Joe Rogan's interview with Robert Malone? Now, just think about that. Like, come on. Like, or imagine if it's like a Scott Horton interview with some military expert on Ukraine or something, or Iraq. Just think about like what kind of world we live in. It would be very different. And I'd say something that world actually already exists here. Now, does it exist in everyone's mind? I don't know. Now, again, this sounds sort of like optimistic, but I think technology is going to push certain things. Now, again, maybe they're instruments of control too. That would be my overall take. I don't take the mantle of it, but a mantle of free speech. I definitely not against it, and I'm not really in a position to censor anybody. So that'd be my overall take. So, I think, do you have any final comments on that? Thanks for doing this episode.
I think your point on golden ages is interesting. I think you could, as you mentioned, plausibly make a case that pre-Charlottesville, because that's when internet censorship went crazy. Well, actually, no, it started going bad in the UK after Brexit because, oh no, Cambridge Analytica was using publicly available information to sell ads to people they think might be swayed by them. It's like, well, since when's that been abnormal behavior? So I would say, so you could argue up until then, you get the smartphone things, people can access it. So when it comes to sort of accessing new and sort of quote unquote dangerous ideas, you could argue that was a golden age. Although you could argue sort of the pre-modern period, if there's no printing press, I mean, yeah, maybe if you said something bad about the parish priest or something, but in a sense, everything is kind of private, and so you couldn't be hounded in kind of the same way. Although that said, a lot would be reputational, and right ruminations would of course make the argument that free speech only really comes into existence in say the 19th century, and is a creation of the modern state, because it was a way of changing social regulation from sort of personal to this more impersonal, larger body further away from you, more distant, which would then allow further space for the development of the individual. But yes, on a practical basis, irrespective of whether it's legal or not, I do think that's an interesting claim and probably largely true. Say up to 2015, that kind of maybe 10-year period, I think 2005 to 2015 would be an interesting one. So I think going forward, I think kind of like the conservative types who are with that pro free speech, they're really not significantly reflective enough, which is, I suppose, not surprising. And I think if they were saying, well, no, what we support is steel manning, and that's the main thing, and in an appropriate space, people say that's fine, and that would be a step forward. That said, of course, you could always have someone steel manning and then say, oh, well, you're steel manning communism really well, but we don't really like you because you're kind of defending communism, or let's seize your kind of bank accounts. Well, not seize them too far, no, you cancel them, like I did with Kanye. Then you kind of got sort of a different area. And to be fair, actually, the background of free speech and cancellation is, to a large extent, you could argue, the monopolization of many areas from a few large firms. So if anybody is cancelled by one of them, you can't actually do anything. I mean, for instance, if you were cancelled by MasterCard or Visa, I mean, how do you do any transactions online? I mean, your only option is crypto. Otherwise, it's basically impossible. Because, I mean, PayPal is basically a version built on top of well, not necessarily SWIFT, but the bank to bank sort of clearing operations and stuff, which Visa and MasterCard have that kind of own version as effectively of. So I think that's certainly related to that. But yeah, focus steel manning rather than free speech, I think, is going to be a more productive way forward. I'm just very concerned to make sure we use terms and know what they actually mean and not sort of trying to hide behind them. But yes, certainly nobody really defends free speech in the absolute strictest sense, not even want to blog. And I'd just like to thank everyone for listening. If you enjoyed this podcast, please share it with your friends and family, and subscribe to us on Podbean on YouTube. The more subscribers we get, the higher we get in search rankings, and the more people can access this material. And if you'd like to contact the show for any reason at all, please contact us at mindcrime@gmail.com. That's mindcrime@gmail.com.